I think that's pretty evident by this point to many of you, but it needs to be said regardless. I love video games. In addition, there are so many kinds of games out there, so many different styles, and so many different experiences to be had. However, I think it's also pretty evident by this point that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the gaming community. Now, I don't feel that it's totally abhorrent, and I certainly don't feel that all gamers are idiots. Evidently, that would include myself, and I don't exactly think that I'm that stupid in this context. Granted, I don't think I'm the smartest either, but the point has been made. In addition, I've met plenty of smart, rational, and all-around nice people who do engage in the practice of playing video games and demonstrate a passion for it, both in person and online. Furthermore, when I'm criticizing the gaming community, or certain factions of said group, I'm not necessarily looking down upon the individuals that compose the group that I'm referring to. I'm learning more and more that I've reached a point where I don't exactly look down upon people as much as I do mentalities. People are very interesting beings in the sense that they can change and evolve over time. Many of the mentalities that I intend on pointing out, I may have utilized at one point in time or another, but as I evaluated them more and more, I discovered their flaws and have since then abandoned them. So with that said, just because someone may utilize a mentality that I criticize, that doesn't mean that they can't do the same as I did, or even if they don't, that still doesn't mean that they can't be smart or otherwise likable people in other respects. So when I say something like, it annoys me that Group A does this, I'm not pretending that I somehow know every individual composing such a group and can come to the conclusion that everyone in Group A is inherently a bad person, because I'd be making a complete idiot of myself if I did. I might do a couple of videos like this, but for now, let's just get to the subject at hand. Some of these mentalities are disturbingly common and easy to find. The one this video will focus on is one of the most common and seems to be present in every faction of the gaming community. Not only is this one of the most common mentalities, but in my opinion, it's one of the dumbest, and I like to call it gaming generation elitism. Now, because I just kind of made up that term, it's only natural that I provide a definition. A brief definition, before moving on and talking about it in more detail. Gaming generation elitism is the mentality in which one strongly believes that their childhood was inherently better than the ones of other individuals who have grown up during a different period in gaming history, otherwise known as a console generation, entirely based on said console generation. So with that introduction out of the way, let me address some of the more obvious issues before getting into some of the bigger problems that I have with this mentality. First of all, how do you evaluate the personal life experiences of someone who isn't you? Also, you base a good childhood not on positive relationships with family and peers or something of the sort, but video games? Chances are that you have no idea who these people are and aren't in position to judge them and their qualities based on whatever the heck was popular at the time in which they grew up in. That brings up another thing that's common with this mentality. Growing up during a period of enlightenment somehow makes you smarter than those less fortunate. However, instead of displaying sympathy for those less fortunate, one utilizing such a mentality often demands not only respect, but also blind worship and even dumber, sympathy. This is especially evident in the 80s kid faction of the gaming community. We had better childhoods. Why? Because our games were so much better. But wait, at the same time, our games were worse. Our childhoods were so bad, you should feel sorry for us. I also find it hilarious that a lot of gamers that belong to such a faction spend so much time talking about how gaming today sucks entirely, and how great it would be if they could just relive the glory days, when in reality, both the gaming industry and indie game scene make so many games solely focused on being retro, so that these people can relive those glory days. Also, many gamers tend to make generalizations about gaming generations that they weren't as involved in that can be very, very easily debunked. The one I can speak for the most being the early 2000s. Almost all of the criticism towards this generation in particular tends to be people just blindly applying their criticism of the prior generation to this one as well. Why? Why did we have to get 3D games? They'll never be as wacky or surreal as 2D games. Yeah, this one in particular I take issue with, because there were so many wonderfully bizarre and crazy games from this time period in particular. But they're all targeted towards little kids! Oh, and games like Super Mario World weren't. Plus, also during this time period, there were games like Sonic Adventure 2, where most of the game's plot focuses on that. Well, they all have bad cameras. I don't even think that's necessarily true. I find it funny that games such as Pac-Man World 2 are bashed for their camera systems, and yet Super Mario 64 is somehow exempt from such criticism, even though it's far more applicable there. The same thing goes for a lot of the other 3D platformers of the time. Okay, there is an exception every once in a while, but for the most part these games are just fine in that context. Well, games at that point in time weren't hard! Oh really, in that case games like the Rogue Squadron series were perfectly easy to beat. Oh, and F-Zero GX is totally easy too. Super Mario Sunshine didn't have Corona Mountain, and Pac-Man World 2 certainly didn't have that friggin' Clyde boss that makes most Contra bosses seem tame. Totally imaginary. Then we get into one of the absolute stupidest things I've seen so much of in the gaming community. Oh, if only they would understand. They don't know what it's like to play these games as kids. Therefore, they don't know the true magic of gaming. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I did not limit myself to exclusively playing what was recent at the time. No. I wanted to play everything I could get my hands on. Whenever I'd go over to a friend's house and saw that they had a system that I didn't have, I would want to play it. You might think, oh, that'd be something like a PlayStation 2, right? Well, sometimes yes, but other times it'd be something like, oh, I don't know, a Nintendo Entertainment System. Just because I didn't inherit any games from my parents or non-existent older siblings doesn't mean that other people I was in consistent contact with didn't either. In fact, whenever I'd go over to my uncle's house, he'd always let me play his Super Nintendo. As a result, games like Super Mario World and Super Mario RPG are some of the most nostalgic games for me. Also, when I was a kid, certain games allowed you to unlock older games like the Pac-Man arcade games in Pac-Man World 2 and the Star Wars arcade games in Rogue Squadron 3. Then there were various compilation discs of older games and even just blatant re-releases. So I was definitely exposed to older games as well as newer ones growing up. So before you say, oh, you started gaming in the early 2000s, you didn't grow up playing games like Super Mario Bros. 3, you don't know gaming! Here's the thing. I did. I remember when it was re-released on the Game Boy Advance, one of my friends got it and invited me over for a sleepover so we can have time to play it. It was glorious. Also, when I was in elementary school, the kids in my grade often talked about games like Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, and so on, and would even bring them to school on occasion. They were relevant then as well. Bringing the argument to modern day, with systems in place like Virtual Console and PlayStation Network who have access to so many older games with considerably low prices, making them not only nice gifts for special occasions, but also far more accessible. So these games are still relevant to younger gamers. In fact, I've had conversations with middle school students about NES, Super Nintendo, and Commodore games. I think that's good enough indication. With the internet, gamers can discover so many different games that they have never even heard of before, so chances are that younger players with a strong passion for gaming will be able to learn about games from all eras and see which ones may or may not appeal to them. So the next generation to come will always have that advantage. Who cares if they experience the superficial novelty of playing the games when they're new? A game's overall quality shouldn't be solely dependent on playing it at a precise time. However, as far as gaming generations go, what one considers to be a generation full of garbage, another person with enough exposure to it can bring out some gems that others may not have taken into account. Not to mention, different people like things for different reasons. which is why I find it irritating when people talk about how the only things that should be around in the gaming industry anymore are the things that solely appeal to them, as opposed to a balance of everything. I just don't think that it's all as black and white as many people would make it seem. If you disagree with any of what I said, that is totally fine. I just wanted to say what I thought of the whole situation.